obviously everyone has seen the reaction that this Innocence of Muslims film has gotten around the world. And I was thinking when I saw that, as writers, how do you respond to something that has such obvious power around the world? Do you guys think that writers and directors of material have responsibility at all for the things they put out there?
I think John has a good answer for that. He's going to say something very provocative right now.
Thank you for
that is career threatening.
I was just going to say, I'm personally not going to touch that question.
We have a film here that potentially has led to people's deaths.
But is it a film?
It's at least a 15-minute film.
I mean, I've seen it. It's hard for me to have that in the same conversation as the kind of stuff that we do.
But you're making a film
it's a different category. It's a different category of endeavor altogether. I mean, it's hard to.
Well, it's meant to incite a riot.
Correct.
So it's not really a creative endeavor. It's like picketing outside a funeral. So.
Should there be?
But to your question, I think the question I think is interesting, which is, but it's also kind of obvious, right? I mean, of course, there's a responsibility, but that probably means different things to different people.
What does it mean to you?
I think I feel, first of all, a responsibility to tell a good story, and then there's also a responsibility to be as truthful as you can be, to not play fast and loose with history, if you're writing about something that's historical or contemporary. And there's an ethical duty if you're writing about people, which I was, who are still participating in the events that you're writing about. In other words, some of the characters, well, most of the characters in my movie are still working active duty, undercover, what have you. So there's a responsibility to protect their identity so they can keep doing that.
But you're also making popular entertainment, and you're finishing the movie now. When it comes down to choice between story and truth being the factual circumstances of what happened, how do you make those choices?
Well, it is entertainment. I mean, it's always entertainment. So, but
that's not mutually exclusive. For a lot of people, for millions of people, this is going to be the interpretation of what happened that day that they see and that influences them.
Well, that would be great.
But it's true, it's going to be. I mean, there's a lot of books, there's a lot of articles, a lot out there, but for a lot of people, this is going to be their interpretation of these events through your eyes and through Catherine's eyes. So, what kind of responsibility do you feel about that?
Like I said, I mean, I feel a responsibility to not play fast and loose with history, to tell a story that I think will stand up, hopefully, for a while, so that people who want to learn about the events could maybe 5 years from now go back and look at the movie and feel like, hey, it's a movie. It's not a documentary, but in some ways, it's more exciting than a documentary because you can bring things to life in a more vivid way.
Just to take the weight off his shoulders for a second, since he's the only one who was willing to respond to that question in any big way, I think his story has a lot to do with actual facts. Life of Pi, though, has a lot of religious themes, and I think all of us, I would assume all of us, are very careful about how we portray different people's sensibilities. Even if we're critiquing how people are behaving in the world, you have to bring a certain sensibility to your work every day, where you care very much about how you portray people, what you're trying to say with your story. And I think that's why initially all of us were a little hesitant when you mentioned that film, which was all about irresponsibility and trying to get a negative reaction from people. So,
with your film, did the CIA get to read the script?
Whoa.
And did they have any rights of approval, or?
Judd, do you want to field that one?
No, let's honestly.
Because I'm undercover for the CIA right now.
And this is a pretty
I mean,
serious.
I'm pulling an Argo with this whole thing.
I'm just saying,
This is a pretty
get it out there.
serious subject. So I'm curious, did
It
they?
is a serious subject. Look, we made the movie independently. One of the things that everybody knows when you make a movie with the studio and it involves the military, there's some give and take there creatively. We decided to forego all that forgo the helicopters, forgo the bases, and make the movie out in the Middle East without any sort of government. So there was no official government vetting or submitting, or it was just the filmmakers kind of doing their thing.
Just one more question about this. Do you show Osama bin Laden in the film?
Sorry?
Do you show Osama bin Laden in the film?
Well, I don't want to get out ahead of the marketing of the movie.
No, I understand,
here,
but I'm coming to another question. So, but do you show him at all in the film?
I think that I would
tell
love for
tell
people.
him.
Thank you.
I don't want to know what
I
they
think it's a
show.
really good, an interesting question. It's an interesting creative choice, and I would love to have this conversation with you after you've seen the movie.
Okay. So then my next question is, if you were going to show Osama bin Laden, to what extent do you humanize a guy like that? There was a very good German film, Downfall, about the last days of Hitler. And it was an extraordinarily human portrait of Hitler. And the danger's always, well, isn't there this conflict between, an artistic challenge of showing a person in his full humanity and then having the danger of whitewashing what he's done?
Right.
So my question is, let's take it on a theoretical level. If it weren't Osama bin Laden, would you feel you have to humanize that person?
I wouldn't even know how to begin to do that movie, to be honest with you. I like to write about things that I know or people that I've met or field research that I've done. So in this case, the movie follows people that were involved in the hunt, and those are the people that I feel most able to write about. So I've never even approached a project like that, like a historical figure that you can't meet or talk to, like Lincoln or what. I wouldn't even know how to begin. That's just not.
But it helped that you hired Alan Arkin to play Bin Laden.
Would it help?
It helped that you hired Alan Arkin to play Bin Laden.
Michael, let me throw this question at you. What we're talking about is an artist's responsibility and responsibility to the truth. In this case, Mark's film is about the hunt for Osama bin Laden. And my question is, if you're presenting an Osama bin Laden or a Hitler, as in the German film Downfall, how much can you humanize that man? And how much is there a danger that in humanizing you get people to sympathize?
Ja, also ich muss gleich dazu sagen, ich habe mich mal sehr gestritten mit dem Bernd Eichinger über diesen Film. Ich finde diesen Film widerlich und dumm.
Really? Why?
Aus dem Grund, weil man kann eine Figur, an der so viel historischer Kontext hängt, nicht humanisieren, um damit ein Melodram zu starten, das vielleicht den einen oder anderen bewegt. Aber was wird bewegt dabei? Welche Emotionen werden warum bewegt? Man muss sich ja, wenn man so ein Thema nimmt, überlegen, was das bedeutet für den, der ihn sieht. Und die Frage ist, die Frage der Verantwortung ist nicht nur eine Frage einer Verantwortung vis-à-vis dem Thema, das man behandelt, sondern es ist immer in erster Linie eine Verantwortung gegenüber dem Zuschauer. Wie weit gebe ich dem Zuschauer die Möglichkeit, selbstständig zu sein und nicht manipuliert zu sein? Es ist immer eine Frage, die Verantwortung ist immer eine Frage der Manipulation. Wie ernst nehme ich den Zuschauer als Subjekt? Wie viel Chance gebe ich ihm, selber an einer Kommunikation mit dem Werk beteiligt zu sein? Wie sehr gebe ich nur sozusagen meine Meinung wieder und versuche ihm meine Meinung aufzudrücken? Oder wie sehr nehme ich ihn ernst und gebe ihm die Chance, selber eine Meinung zu bilden? Das ist, glaube ich, eine grundsätzliche Frage, egal ob man jetzt über Hitler oder über irgendein ganz privates Schicksal spricht.
Would you make a film about Hitler?
No.
Why?
Aus dem Grund, weil man bestimmte Dinge, ich finde auch, setze ich mich vielleicht hier in die Nesseln, ich finde einen Film wie ein Spielberg-Film über das Konzentrationslager auch falsch. Ich kann nicht ein Spannungsfeld Moment daraus machen, ob aus der Dusche Gas oder Wasser kommt. Ja. Das ist meiner Meinung nach eine falsche Herangehensweise. Man kann bestimmte Dinge, es gibt einen Film für mich über das Thema Holocaust, das ist Nuit pro Jahr von Alain René, der hatte sich sozusagen dem Thema in dieser Weise genähert, dass er sagt, wie stehst du dazu, du der Zuschauer, was ist deine Position? Sobald ein solches Thema zur Unterhaltung wird, ist es von vornherein meiner Meinung nach schon undiskutabel.
Do you agree? Are there some subjects that you should not touch in film? John?
Wow.
Yeah, John.
Back to Judd.
Perfect.
When you said the "ja" part, I was so happy it ended.
Stuff involving oil companies.
No, but let's try and get a serious answer. Is there a subject that you can't tackle in film?
Well, I think that the point that I was really interested in is the manipulation. I think that the idea of manipulating your audience to believe something, or to believe it the way that it wasn't done, and trying to portray it as something completely different that didn't really happen, I think is incredibly dangerous. So, to delve into certain subject matter, I think is always, in my opinion, important as far as to sort of observe it and live through it and experience it, but at the same time exactly to the end that he's asking you to do, which is the responsibility of saying, what do you feel about it, rather than this is what I believe happened, you should all take this as truth. And I think that's where we're getting in trouble, both with the innocence of Muslims and obviously his opinion on downfall.
Chris, you had to deal with suddenly a very difficult political situation, and you chose to portray a lot of the Iranians as very human in Argo. What kind of discussions did you have about that? What kind of thinking went into dealing with that subject?
Well, the first thing is that Ben and I thought it would be very easy to create sort of, I mean, there's no particular antagonist in Argo, right? The sort of antagonist is the general sort of revolution and the unpredictability of the world in Tehran. So we thought it would be very easy to depict sort of the other as orcs. They're just these nameless people who are out there who sort of vaguely want to kill you, but they don't. There's not a specific face. They're just sort of a general threat. And we decided that we couldn't. We had no interest in doing that. So right from the beginning, Ben and I talked about how we had to have some context for what's going on in Iranian society at the beginning, which is how the prologue of the film happened. That you had to begin to understand that these aren't, this isn't just a generic image of what we think of as the Arab street, of just angry people who seem to be burning flags for no reason. You needed to understand the source of the rage. And then as the film went on, we began to try to find small moments of, and they're not even necessarily narrative points, but they're almost just images. I mean, there's an image at the beginning of the film during the siege of the embassy of an old woman who's standing there with a photograph of her dead son, who the Shah killed. And you only see it very briefly. But when that image came up, I thought, here's the dirty wars in South America and all these other images that you've seen that immediately take something political and turn it into something just immediately viscerally human. So we began to think, how could we really show that throughout the film? How can you weave in these images of people who are struggling under a difficult political regime and have, in some cases, very valid rage, and in some cases, sort of inchoate rage that is striking out at any target?
You took some liberties with factual truth. In the real-life story, the embassy workers hide in two places, not one. There was some complaint by the Canadian ambassador after the film that Canada hadn't been given its due. How much discussion went into how far you can bend the truth to make a story more effective?
Well, for example, there were two fantastic characters called John and Zena Sheardown who worked at the Canadian embassy, and they were the other people who helped to house the six. They're fantastic characters. I mean, Zena Sheardown in particular, it broke my heart that I couldn't put her in because she wasn't even a Canadian national, so she didn't have diplomatic protection, and yet she risked her life to help to shelter these people. But ultimately, you look at a narrative and you think, how much information can we present that the audience can having people hiding in two different locations in Tehran, and having, more characters and trying to understand a very complicated situation. How what's the breaking point, for that amount of narrative information. And so ultimately we decided to take some aspects of them and composite them into Ken and Pat Taylor. I think, although obviously deviating from factual truth, I think in essence we're saying these Canadian people risked their lives to shelter, people who needed them. And so I don't feel sort of that we compromised in any kind of in any essential thematic way. But sure, we had lots of discussions about, I mean, of course, with any of our stories, we choose the protagonist, right? And thereby, by choosing the protagonist, you're choosing not to portray all these other people, whether we're working in fiction or things that are based on nonfiction. And so when I decided, with the producers that it was Tony Mendez's story, of course, all kinds of people fall away. I mean, there would be a great, as Ben and I would say, there would be a great Iranian film solely from the perspective of the housekeeper, Sahar, who's really one of my favorite characters. I mean, Farhadi or Magee or Kiarostami can make a fantastic film about that woman. Or there would be there has been actually a Canadian film about Ken and Pat Taylor. There would be a fantastic film about some of the revolutionaries, these young men who, are enraged and decide that they're going to take on the world's greatest superpower at the gates of the embassy, right? But when you decide it's about this mission and about the CIA guy, all those other stories, hopefully their voices are somewhere in the mosaic. I mean, to mix a visual and sort of an audio metaphor, but hopefully their pictures are somewhere in the photo mosaic, but you can't necessarily.
Did you go to Iran?
I did not go to Iran, no. I did as much research as I could, and at a certain point, I talked to the producers about doing it. But the thing is, once you accept a job, if you go to Iran, you're going as a person who's working for the Smokehouse Warner Brothers film, and then suddenly it's a whole other issue because you're not, if the day before I signed the contract, I probably could have gone to Iran, and I would have loved to have gone to Iran. But the day after, then, you have the weight of.
But you did go to the CIA.
I did. I spent a bunch of time with not only with Tony Mendez but also with other CIA officers.
What surprised you about that?
How quotidian and normal the life was, that you would. Because in the world of Bond or even Bourne, these guys are radically alone. There are these solitary figures out there in the world. But Tony Mendez had to go home and kiss his wife and kids, and before he'd go on these missions, he would. And this is something that Mark has dealt with in his other work as well. You have to somehow, that world has to come back to the domestic world, and the collision of those two worlds is a really interesting thing. When Tony would take off his wedding ring before getting on a plane and assuming an identity, that was a real ritual that he had. He would take off his wedding ring, put it in a certain spot on his dresser, and then he would go off to his, under his false identity. And that image was with me right from the time Tony told me about it, and I think Ben really beautifully, and I think subtly, put it into the film.
Is there any subject you would not feel comfortable writing?
There are a lot of subjects that I would not feel qualified writing, and not just from a research perspective, but just from a personal perspective. I'm not sure how I feel about whether or not there are certain image bans and taboos in the world. I was very interested in what Michael said about the suspense of the shower in Schindler's List, because it's, in a sense, it's the same in Argo. It's the suspense of whether the plane is going to lift off or not, and I'm not sure about the ethical implications of taking real people's lives and trying to make it a nail biter, and I have mixed feelings about it. I think it's a great sort of observation that Michael makes.
Judd, is there any film that you'd feel uncomfortable with? You've mainly made comedy. Would you want to go into drama? Would you feel comfortable taking on a historical film? Are there areas that you personally don't feel comfortable with?
Well, I'm just interested in personal exploration, and that's just kind of where my mind has led me. It's not really an avoidance of anything. It's just more not understanding who I am, and that topic kind of being foremost in my mind.
What's really interesting to me, Matt and I were talking about this, is your film, This is 40, which I guess most people haven't seen, is seems to be autobiographical. Your wife's in it, your kids are in it. How do you, I would imagine that the challenges of autobiography is just as difficult as the challenges of biography.
Well,
Is it autobiography?
it's tricky because I don't want my wife and kids to be sympathetic. I'm worried. I don't want to humanize them for the world. What was your question? I'm sorry.
How much do you depart? How much is it autobiographical and how much is it fictional?
Well, it's interesting. It's a soup of real feelings and events, things I'm noticing about my friends and the other actors who make a big contribution, and stuff I'm just making up to make it more interesting. And hopefully within that soup, you don't think it's all perfectly accurate. But it's emotionally 100% accurate. I mean, the feelings and the ideas are right on the money.
Was there ever a point where your wife or your daughter said, you can't have this in the script?
Yeah, I mean, all the time. I said that a lot of times. You know,
Such
Leslie
as?
might pitch something and say, "Why don't you talk about that?" And I'm like, "No, we're not doing that. that's too embarrassing, and
Okay.
I can't show that side of myself to the world yet." But we all have kind of an open conversation about like what is right and wrong to say, and who will it hurt if we talk about it. Because a lot of it is exaggerated and fabricated. So if we show a fight between a husband and a wife, it's not exactly how Leslie and I would fight. It's kind of the worst case scenario of how bad it could get, and hopefully the worse it gets, then there's some humor there. I always feel like when people are out of control, I find it funny. A lot of this has been inspired by the fact that I found that in a lot of movies and television, I didn't feel like couples were arguing and interacting the way that we did at our house. And I don't know if we're different than everybody else, but I thought, it gets a little more heated around here and raw, and I wanted to show that in a movie.
What was your very starting point? I'm going to ask everybody this question. What was the very, very beginning of the idea for that film?
I wanted to write something about this age. I assume probably it's just that I was having my own midlife questioning, let's call it, and reading a lot about it. And because there's that moment where you just take stock. How did I do? How did I do with this relationship, with my family, with my job? How am I getting along with all my relatives? How do I just feel as a person on earth and with my spirituality? And that's a tough moment. So I wanted to write about that, and I started listing actors. And then it just hit me, I have this couple that people were really interested in, that they liked a lot. And I never felt like I had enough time and Knocked Up to show what their issues really were. It was interesting to just see them crackle, and we sensed, there's a lot going on here. And suddenly I knew, I should just really show you what's happening between them. Because in Knocked Up, there's a sequence where both couples kind of break up, and Paul Rudd and Seth Rogen go to Vegas, and they take mushrooms, and Paul is on mushrooms talking about how he can't accept love, and all his wife wants to do is hang out with him, and why can't he accept it? And then they go home, and suddenly, Paul and Leslie, they're just back together, and Seth tries to get back together with Catherine, and she won't get back together with him. And I never showed why they got back together, because I thought, because they're married, and when you have kids, you have to work it out. And I thought, with this movie, I'm going to show what happened in the middle.
So was the final script close to your starting idea?
My starting idea is almost nothing. I mean, I don't really have a starting idea other than let's talk about what's happening here. And that's it. And then slowly, I start talking to Leslie, and it's a 2-year process of conversations with Leslie about how we're feeling. And what's interesting about it is it's almost a coded discussion about our relationship. So I'll say, you think Pete kind of thinks this, and she's like, I think Pete's full of crap thinking that. And then we're kind of having a debate about our issues through the characters, and it's a weird, safe place to work out issues. And so, we just keep countering each other with scenes and then hopefully at the end it's balanced out.
What was the starting point for Promised Land? How did you and Matt Damon end up working together?
Well, I actually had the idea, I guess it was a little under 2 years ago. I just really wanted to write a script about American identity and where we were at, and sort of the idea of taking on the personal journey that the country was going through. And, you know, aside from all the political and all the nonsense, you know, to be honest, I probably subconsciously wrote the script for my dad. Like, my dad grew up in Pittsburgh and worked in a steel mill town, at a steel mill, and, you know, not in that trite way that life was simpler, but life was simpler in this much more dedicated, faith in each other way, that we believed that tomorrow was going to be better, and we believed in each other, and we believed that we were the ones who were going to take us to the next place. And that, to me, is sort of, in a very fundamental way, not the case anymore. But I really believe that it can be. And so I just wanted to tell a story about one person, kind of in a Capra-esque way, tell the story of a man who was, you know, given the opportunity to take, you know, to be in a world and take a job where, you know, whether it was the derivatives market or something, I hadn't figured it out yet, but someone who was willing to hit that seventh gear that your car doesn't really have, but you'll get there faster, and sort of the moral dilemma of whether or not we should be doing that. And it actually started out as when I brought it to Dave Eggers. Dave Eggers and I sat around and hashed out the ideas, and, you know, obviously a lot of these issues are very, very close to his heart. And so it was really fantastic to be able to talk to somebody who was, you know, right there in it emotionally and intellectually with me. And we actually came up with this idea about wind power. We had read an article that people were erecting wind towers for tax credits, and then the law didn't actually stipulate that they had to work, but the fact that you had done the job allowed you to get a tax credit, and then they'd sell it off to the coal companies. And that story had happened in small particular places, but it wasn't an overall, you know, epidemic. So we sort of derailed from there, and then I started reading all about natural gas, and just thought that that was the most fantastic backdrop for what I was going through, having nothing to do with natural gas or which side of the line you fall on, because our movie, I think, leaves it up to you to decide which way you fall, but to take responsibility for what is going on. To, you know, it's sort of like the idea of a hand-me-down car from your dad. You know what I mean? If your dad took really good care of the car and you have to, after this, give it to your little brother, and you ride the car into the ground, like, you can say, yeah, it's just circumstance, but probably the fact that you were driving 150 miles an hour and riding the brakes and, you know, gear shifting and blowing out the transmission when your dad didn't do those things is a fact. It's just a fact.
And what did Matt change when he came? What was the single biggest thing he changed?
Matt and I were working on once we decided to go to an actual script, Matt and I started on the windmill discussion, and we wrote the entire script as the windmill movie.
How did you guys work together?
Fantastically.
No, not meaning actually. Like, did you write scenes and send to him, or did you guys work together?
Luckily, he was actually shooting We Bought a Zoo in Malibu at the time, and so we just worked together every single week, and how he juggled 4 kids and, you know,
but like
home
every
life.
day at your place in an office?
It was every weekend for sure, and then
Where?
In his house.
Okay.
He has the children, so he wins by default. Yeah. And we would just sit down and write and hash out every single scene and come up with an idea. Whoever came up with the idea, we'd just hash it out and see if it would work. And we wrote really, really quickly. That wasn't the sort of experience where we wrote 1,000 pages and came down to, you know, 120. We pretty much had 120 the entire time. We knew where the structure was because of what we had laid out story-wise before I even brought it to Matt. And he really, really loved it and was actually going to direct it. And that was the whole plan, to have him direct. And
why didn't he?
His schedule is a Matt Damon schedule, but he was extremely busy, but also projects that he thought would be pushed away actually started to come together much quicker, especially Liberace, which he didn't think he would be doing as quickly as he did. And so he just said, I don't want to jam my first directorial debut into this small window where I may or may not have the full capabilities to do it, which I think is incredibly smart, as hard as it was to hear, you know, just before Christmas.
Was this your first screenplay? Yes. What surprised you about writing it?
That I could do it. I think that I would always heard from my friends that sort of the blank white page was terrifying, and I was like, come on, there's a lot of things that are terrifying. And then you realize that it's one of the scarier things to actually put yourself out there and be telling a story that's very personal is really hard, and I think will be hard until the day that the movie comes out and maybe even beyond. But the experience was so incredibly thrilling to me. And to have Matt and Gus as, you know, teammates and partners they're so incredibly confident in what they do, and so that confidence really helps you take bold choices and hope that they work out for the best. And we
Judd,
did.
what's your writing process? Do you lock yourself in a room to write longhand? What's the mechanical part of it?
That's my process on this couch. This couch, I'm gonna sit.
It's tough, man.
It's pulling my,
Nice.
pulling my shirt out. I feel like my buttons are going to show my chest hair. I'm sorry. Is this uncomfortable for you?
No, I'm enjoying it.
My process is I have to set like hours, like banker's hours. I used to write late at night. I would start when my family went to sleep at 9:30, 10 o'clock, and just work till I ran out of gas. But now that I have to wake up at 6:30 and drive kids to school and attempt to exercise so I don't die, there's no time anymore. So the only way I can write is to just, tell my assistant, all right, we're going to start at 9 tomorrow and let's unplug the phones for 4 hours. And it's awful.
And you do that 5 days a week, every day, just when you're on a project?
Well, usually I have to give myself like a reward. So I'll say if I write a good hour, I'll watch one episode of The Wire. And at one point I was watching 2 different seasons of The Wire at the same time. I was watching season 2 and season 4 and kind of going, I don't know why. I just watched them out of order. And
you write alone in a computer?
Sometimes I have to have someone type and I'll just talk, and other times I type. This was a hard one because I wrote it almost like a documentary, and I had a lot of scenes that could go anywhere in the movie. I mean, there were literally scenes I shot with everyone in 2 different shirts because I wasn't sure where in their lives it would go, but I knew it was an important thing to do, and so
that's interesting.
It wastes a lot of money too to do that. But it was, and then I have to kind of put it through the mill of Leslie and Paul and all the actors. But then we go into an extended rehearsal period with Albert Brooks and John Lithgow, and everybody comes in and we read and then we improvise, and then I go off again and try to figure out what to use from
Mark, how did
that.
Writing 0.30 change as real life incidents took over? Because you were working on that project and then Bin Laden was captured. Did you have to change the script?
Yeah, I mean, I had started, probably 10 years ago thinking about, after 9/11, thinking about which was the big defining sort of event of my adulthood or what have you. Then the next big event was losing Osama bin Laden in Tora Bora. And so I started thinking about that, which right after it happened, and then literally writing a screenplay for it in, I don't know, like 2006 or 2007, I started on that. And then I got sidetracked. Hurt Locker came out. We had the success that we had. I began working on a story about the drug trade for Paramount. That picked up some momentum, and then it fizzled. And then when that started slowing down, I went back to the Osama bin Laden story and the hunt for him, and this big kind of catastrophic failure to catch him in Tora Bora. And had written a script, had financing. We were cast and basically in early stages of pre-production. I was polishing the script. I remember about to show it to Joel Edgerton, who was interested in being in the movie, when they got him. So I had been telling people for years that this was an amazing story of how they didn't get him, and then I was sort of at that point so married to the subject.
Were you mad they got him because then you had to do rewrites?
Did you get him? Was it you?
It was actually a really personal thing for me because of 9/11 and being a New Yorker. But as far as it presented an odd choice, right? As far as the writing, which is one, you throw away 2 years of work and you take what you know and redo it and do it quickly and get it out there because you know somebody else is. Or 2, you just sort of walk away from it. And I chose the first and revamped it and called Catherine and said, what if it's this and not that? And she said, well, okay, you write it, I'll do it. And fortunately, Megan Ellison had been backing the original version, so there was a call to her along the same lines. And then we just kind of put pedal to the metal, but it was definitely a turn on the dime, kind of throw a lot of work
Did
out
you change
situation.
did you change just the third act, or did you completely reconceive
It
the whole
was
thing?
it was
But you hadn't started shooting when all
from the
this was
beginning.
done.
We had not started shooting,
Yeah.
no.
Do you get paid again?
No.
Is that considered like a rewrite or a new script?
That's just considered, you know,
Is that a
You're very,
polish?
you're very connected to sort of real life dramas in the very modern world. What's your writing, and you were a journalist and still are, what's your writing process?
Well, this one was a little different for me. The first screenplay I did really came directly out of journalism, and I, at that time, was very much a newly minted screenwriter, and I had been to Iraq and written articles about Iraq and then wrote a screenplay about Iraq. This one I approached much more, I think, as in a more traditional screenwriterly fashion, if you will, of thinking about it from the beginning as a film. I mean, I still did a lot of field research, and a lot of homework went into it, but it was much more of a traditional screenwriting process.
But do you write at home? Do you write in a typewriter? Do you
Do I write at
go from
home?
beginning to end? What's the actual process of writing?
I do. The process is I try to find out as much as I can about the subject through talking to people who are involved in whatever it is I'm writing about, and then yeah, I write in all sorts of places. I don't have a routine. I wish I did. I really want one, but I write at home. Sometimes I write in a coffee shop.
What
it's
most
wherever.
surprised you in that research?
Well, there's a lot that surprised me. I mean, I knew a little bit about the intelligence world, pretty familiar with the world of special operations, I think, but how few people were actually involved over the course of a 10-year hunt. I mean, you would think, and it's partly true, that there are hundreds and hundreds of people in the U.S. government that touch upon the subject of where's Osama bin Laden, and that's true. There are hundreds and hundreds of people, and if you take a 10,000-foot view, it's probably thousands of people. But when you narrow it down to who are the people that wake up every day and that's their sole focus, not that it touches their wheelhouse, but it's like what they do day in and day out, it's a much smaller number, and that was surprising. And it made my life a little bit easier as a dramatist, because even though we have more than 100 speaking parts in the film, so because I was trying to capture some of the tapestry, but it does actually focus on a few people who it turns out were particularly instrumental in the history of it all.
You got caught up in a sort of big political drama about how come these guys have been given access? How did that affect you personally and your writing, and the decision to change the release date of the film?
It doesn't make it easier. I mean, before The Hurt Locker, it was a little bit easier to do. I mean, I sort of did the same thing that I've always done in terms of the research, but after The Hurt Locker, it's like you go to DC and you're the Academy Award winner, not just a guy with a pencil and like asking questions. And I had Maureen Dowd calling me and Republicans attacking me before I'd even written the new script, saying what it was and wasn't, and I was like so that was surreal and not helpful. But at the same time, it's a election year, and if you make the decision to do something that's topical and current, then I think you're going to have to accept that other people are going to perhaps use whatever it is that you might be doing for their own purposes, and that's kind of the nature of the game.
But you agreed to shift the release date of the film to after the election.
Well, I don't actually, much as I would like to,
Yes.
control the release schedule of the Sony Corporation.
Do you agree with that decision?
Well, I do, because there was no way that I think the original idea that they had was sometime in October, and it's October 1st, and we're not anywhere. I mean, we will be finished for December, but we only finished shooting in June. So that was a pretty ambitious timeline. Even December is a pretty ambitious timeline from a year and a half after the event to have a completed movie. A lot of people worked like 80-hour weeks and killed themselves to make all those different deadlines. So I think it's good because it would have really sucked to have said we were going to hit a deadline and then missed it.
If you were writing about Romney and Obama as characters, how would you approach them? Comedy, drama?
You're looking at me. I wouldn't approach the subject at all. I don't think.
Judd,
How would I approach it?
Would it interest you?
I'm sure somewhere in the room, Danny Strong is writing that screenplay right now. I hope it'll be hilarious. Well, I think it's funny with somebody like Romney who changes his positions all the time just to get elected. I think that's tragic, but also hilarious. Somebody who doesn't, believe in a lot of what he says. And there's nothing more interesting than that. That's why the Sarah Palin movie was interesting also. I mean, I don't think we've ever had a person like that where there's such an enormous record that they've changed their position on every important issue that faces our country.
Let's say that you were given this assignment of making this a film. What would be your starting point? What would most interest you about that? Chris?
I never get these assignments. Nobody ever calls me these assignments.
Let's say you did. What would interest you dramatically in that?
There is something that I've been thinking about, which is recently there's been, I think, Maureen Dowd and others have written about Obama as an introvert, and the fact that whereas Clinton would go down to the lobby and schmooze every guy around and buy them a drink till 2 a.m, Obama would take stock of the room and then go back upstairs to his hotel room and close the door. And there's something very interesting to me about that, and of course, obviously I don't know Obama, maybe all these opinions are wrong, but if I were to create a character, I would say, how do you create a guy who can dazzle 40,000 people in a stadium, but internally is a very shy, sort of, maybe even, who knows, dark type of guy, I mean, obviously, I haven't seen Lincoln. I don't know whether this is touched upon, but people will say the same about Lincoln, that he had this melancholy, and yet he could inspire the nation. So that's an interesting thing to me. The Romney side, I don't know, but maybe it's not a movie, maybe it's a play or a novel or a haiku. But there's something interesting about that character to me.
What's your starting point? Is it the character or is it the story? Chris, let's go back to you. You had a very strong story going in. What was your way in? Was it a particular character? Was it a moment that interested you?
Well, certainly there's a moment at the end when Tony Mendez, the CIA officer, has to go home, and that was one of the first things in my head, was him going home to his kid's bedroom. But then there was, and I think for all of us probably, you can't really write until the characters kind of show up one day, like show up for work and tell you what they're going to say and what they're not going to say. But the other thing, I suppose, was there's another moment in the film where there's a reading of the fake screenplay, and you begin going all over the world and seeing all these different plots. And pretty early on, I had a sense that maybe if you could create some world where the fictional and the real geopolitical stakes and Hollywood satire and all these things are beginning to mix in this babel of voices, that maybe that's the tone of the film lies somewhere in that babel of voices. So some of it was almost like it sounds like crazy or pretentious, but almost like a rhythm, like beginning to, I mean, I don't know whether maybe you guys feel the same. It's like even with some writers, it's like you read some, David Mamet, and it's almost like you could figure out what the notes are. You start to hear the rhythm of the way that people talk, and if you're lucky, and with some projects it doesn't happen, but with other projects you start to hear how people talk, and then it becomes a an easier job.
Michael, what's the starting point for you? What was the very genesis of Amour? What was the first thought that you had that led to that film?
Ja, mir ist wie wahrscheinlich den meisten von uns in meiner Familie was Ähnliches begegnet. Also ein Mensch, den ich sehr geliebt habe, hat gelitten, physisch gelitten, und ich musste hilflos zusehen. Und es war so ziemlich eine der bittersten Erfahrungen, die man im Leben machen kann. Und das war sozusagen der Ausgangspunkt, über dieses Thema nachzudenken. Aber die Geschichte, die der Film erzählt, hat mit der persönlichen Geschichte überhaupt nichts zu tun.
Are you worried that a film might be too difficult to watch. You know, in the Hollywood world, entertainment is, I guess, first and foremost.
Die Frage ist,
Sorry to
die
finish
Frage
the
ist,
question.
was ist Entertainment? Ne?
My point is, I went with a friend of mine who's 86, and she was really shattered by the film. Her husband had died in similar circumstances. This wasn't entertaining for her. This was extraordinarily painful. Is that good or bad when you hear that?
Wenn er so erlebt hat, ist es nicht gut, aber ich habe sehr viele Echos von dem Film jetzt von Menschen gehört, die alle persönlich betroffen sind, wie ich schon vorher sagte. Es ist ja so, dass man, wenn man in einem bestimmten Alter ist, gibt es immer irgendjemand in der Familie, der in einer ähnlichen Situation ist. Und die meisten Menschen sind gekommen und haben sich bedankt, weil sie den Film eigentlich tröstlich fanden. Aber es gibt kein Rezept. Natürlich kann man in bestimmten Umständen durch die Ähnlichkeit des eigenen Lebens mit dem Dargestellten das auch als schrecklich empfinden. Aber das heißt, was wäre die Alternative, nicht davon zu sprechen? Und das kann keine Alternative sein.
So is it okay for entertainment to make people feel terrible?
To make people so ich glaube, die Wahrheit ist immer okay.
I want to ask you, all of you, when you're approaching your work, do you think of another film, another person? Do you have a role model? I think Robert Zemeckis said before he makes a film, he always sees The Godfather, watches The Godfather again. How about you? David, do you look at another work for inspiration?
Not a particular one. I think you're always looking for analogies to the kind of story that you're trying to tell as a vague template for where to begin. You're trying to find, I thought what he said was excellent about that, you're trying to find the rhythm of what you're trying to tell. So you might have your story in mind, the basic steps of it, but you're looking for the tone, you're looking for the pacing.
Who did you look for when you were working on Life of Pi?
Oh, we searched all over the place. I actually, I did a lot of reading of like Ulysses and stuff like that because we were looking for that kind of going out on the ocean in search of land, essentially, and we read a lot of that, but that was not ultimately the tone we landed on at all. And we spent a lot of time less about looking at some specific person's work, but doing the kind of research, going to India, going to different places, trying to find the right way to open the story. And we went back and forth with ideas for months, and then one day a couple of lines came, and that was the rhythm of it, and it had the right. And after months of stalling and stumbling, we wrote a very rough first draft in about 3 weeks, and then polished it and changed it completely over the next several months. But
John, how about you? I mean, especially going into the first screenplay, did you look at any particular films, read any other scripts?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think
What in particular?
I probably am watching movies or parts of movies, and I sometimes throw in movies for a scene all the time. This is even before I was writing. It's just something that, I think that the connection with characters is, as a writer, or rather hearing writers say that they need to get into headspace, it's almost more, for me, it was about getting into some sort of weird heart space where you're actually feeling like, how is this going to impact your audience?
I wonder if there's any film you watched as a guide, any book you read as a model.
Yeah, there were a couple actually. I remember watching Michael Clayton several times because there's that idea of a character who's not inherently all good, or his decisions aren't all pure, and yet the instinct that he has and where he wants to end up is good and pure. And so I definitely watched Michael Clayton a whole bunch of times before and during writing. Yeah, I think, I'm also just a classics fanatic too. I mean, I'd say more like 70s. So I think The Godfather I watched several times, again, just to get in that heart space, even though it has nothing to do with our movie. except for the fact that Matt's a gangster.
Yes.
So if you
What
haven't
about
seen
you?
it,
You have very distinct comedic voice.
Well, I watched Scenes from a Marriage, which I hadn't seen before.
Are you serious?
And was surprised that there was a lot of humor in it.
That's really interesting. That's the last film I thought you were going to mention.
Yeah, I mean, there's really, it went really, it goes obviously very deep into their relationship, and there's a lot of unmasked feelings in it, and there were moments that I thought were very funny also. I tend to watch things that inspire me to have the courage to not follow classic structure. So I'll watch, Husbands, John Cassavetes film, or a lot of his movies. You just don't know where they're going to go, and the one thing I try to do when I'm writing is to have there be no way you can predict where this story is going to move.
Surprise is so crucial in storytelling. You have a great surprise at the end of the film, which I won't give away. But
thank you for saying that.
Mark, what about you? Do you read, look at films?
Sometimes, yeah.
What in particular? When you were working on this
yeah,
film, what did you...
Probably a little less so than I did in the past. But anytime I think anytime I'm sitting down to write, there are a lot of other writers in the room that are...
Name one or two particularly that you thought of when you were working on this.
I mean, there's all the contemporary guys that I look up to. I mean, but it's just, for me, it's like, how much do you let them in and how much do you keep, I mean, Zalian and Sorkin and Logan and those guys are in there, and Pearson's in there, and and everyone's in there, and you just got to kind of be like, all right, you guys are here, and I definitely feel the weight of everything and all the good work that's constantly being done, and then there are guys in the bleachers from, like, I don't know, Bellow or Salinger
But there's no one film that you looked at as a model.
I mean, film-wise, I mean, All the President's Men, not as a model, but that's a movie that had a lot of information in it.
I immediately thought that because William Goldman made that great decision to end with failure, with them not uncovering Watergate.
I mean, it's a pretty well-written movie.
Yeah.
So I watched that a couple times, but Orwell's in that room for me too. So ultimately, it's not necessarily, there are a lot of cinematic references, but there are a lot of references that are not necessarily purely cinematic for me. That are political.
Michael, when you were making a film, do you think, are there any other films in particular that are your lodestars?
Nein, ich habe als Kritiker begonnen, da habe ich sehr viele Filme gesehen. Ich bin ein besessener Leser, aber wenn ich mich einem Thema zuwende, versuche ich möglichst wenig zu diesem Thema zu sehen oder zu lesen, weil mich das zu sehr ablenken würde von mir selber.
Well, two quick questions. As a critic, is there one filmmaker who particularly inspires you?
Ja, also ich meine, natürlich hat mich am Anfang meiner Arbeit Bresson sehr beeinflusst, und ich habe lang daran gearbeitet, mich ein bisschen von diesem Einfluss zu lösen. Aber es haben mich natürlich 1000 Filmemacher, wie jeden von uns, haben mich 1000 Filmemacher beeinflusst, und dafür bin ich auch sehr dankbar. Aber ich hoffe natürlich, dass man im Laufe seines Lebens dann so eine eigene Sprache findet.
And the other question was, what were you reading before Amour?
Was ich vor Amour gelesen habe, Sie werden es nicht glauben, eine Neuübersetzung von Krieg und Frieden.
I don't believe. Last question, Matt has something. If you weren't writers, or actors, or directors, what profession would you be most drawn to, John?
I actually was always planning on being an English teacher, and actually went to college for that and wanted to be, I think I was way too over-influenced by, Dead Poet Society, and I thought I could get a bunch of kids to stand up on desks. But yeah, no, I was planning on doing that even the day I graduated from college, and actually had to make up a semester, and all my friends had graduated, so in order to make up the semester, I didn't want to go back to the school, so I went to this theater school to kind of take the easy way out and ended up getting completely inspired.
Judd, what about you?
Out of the arts completely. I've thought about teaching. I mean, teaching is something that I think I would enjoy. I think the most fun I ever had, though, in a different job was I was a dishwasher at El Torito. And there was something so relaxing about the dishes come in, you make them clean, you put them back. It was such a clear-headed experience that all these years of just worrying about, is it working and what will people think of it? It's fantastic, but really painful to be that neurotic.
So you can always go back to being a dishwasher.
I dream of cleaning that plate again.
David?
Yeah, before he said it, I immediately thought teacher. I'd be a teacher of something.
Of what?
Well, I don't know. I've been in the arts so long that I don't know what else I'm capable of doing.
What did you do before writing?
I started as an actor in theater, and then from there did voiceover and did a lot of moving
what
around,
about
and I
you?
ended up writing.
God, I mean, my equivalent of dishwasher is like I've always wanted to, I grew up in New York and always used to ride the Staten Island ferry, so my dream job was to just be out on the water all day, doing something that felt like it had some tangible reality, which is the boat goes here, the boat goes there, you tie the rope, I mean, I think we all, as writers, living so much in our heads all the time, we fantasize about teleological things, where you need to start A and finish with B. But yeah, I also think I probably would have ended up in some teaching capacity. I mean, I was going to go to grad school in English and philosophy. I sort of was working on things like language theory and shit like that. So
Mark, other than being a journalist,
I've actually thought about this a lot,
Yeah.
especially during lean years, and I'm basically unemployable. So, I've been
if
making
you
a living
were,
as a
what would
writer
you-
since I was like 20.
what would interest you?
I can't, there's nothing. I would love to be a race car driver, but I don't have. I'm not that good at it.
That's interesting.
But I'm not. There aren't. Unfortunately, I don't.
What do you like about
I don't
race
really
car
know
driving?
how to do anything else.
What draws you to race car driving?
What draws me to it? Well, it's just like a really productive use of my time, I think.
And Michael, I'm going to ask you, this is the final question. If you weren't a critic, writer, director, have you ever thought what else you'd do?
Was? Wenn ich es mir aussuchen hätte dürfen, da oben, wo die Geschenke verteilt werden, dann wäre ich gerne Komponist und Dirigent geworden. Aber mein Stiefvater war Komponist und Dirigent und hat mir rechtzeitig davon abgeraten, weil ich zu wenig Talent hatte.
Good.